Good afternoon, and welcome to our webinar this afternoon. If you're on, I don't want to take up any of our precious time, but I do want to welcome you. If you're on this webinar, you know the issues on campus that have prompted this very important discussion, which has ramifications for our university and for our nation and beyond. I'm really very grateful for the distinguished Professor Hilton Als for joining us this afternoon and for his insights, and also to our own Professor Fritz Bauerschmidt of the Theology Department, who will engage in a conversation with Professor Als. So with that, welcome all, thanks all, enjoy the discussion. Take it away, Dr. Bauerschmidt.
Thank you, Father Lennane. Professor Als, I guess just as a kind of an opening question, could you maybe tell us something about sort of the origins of your engagements with Flannery O'Connor? And I know you've written several, I think, really important essays on O'Connor. And so I'm just kind of curious, like, what was your initial encounter with O'Connor like, and how did you how have you continued to engage her work in your own?
I think that if you have, if you're lucky enough to have the evidence of American genius, you never exhaust it. And I think that she's a genius. And I think that she's one of the more accurate representations that we've ever had about the modern American South. And I think initially, I met her work through an older friend, probably when I was a teenager. And it was, I would imagine, sometime in high school, 15 or 16. And the big collected stories had come out. And I was just really amazed by this world. I had never been to the American South before, but then my mother moved to Georgia subsequently, and I remember having many moments of O'Connor-like, it was sort of like metafiction, living down there for a while. I remember once getting off a bus and I was helping an older white woman down the stairs along with another Black man, and she said, I'm amazed and grateful that you are kind to me, because when I was a young girl, I was terrible to you people. And I remember it like it was yesterday, and remember thinking, was Flannery a reporter, really? Was she taking what she knew of the American South and adding metaphor to that, you know?
Yeah, I mean, she's often, was kind of classified in that genre of Southern grotesque. And I think she once commented that everything in her stories that is realistic, people think is grotesque, and everything that's grotesque, people think is realistic.
Yes.
So that, I mean, as somebody, I grew up in the South. And so
Where did you grow up, Frederick?
In South Carolina. So pretty deep South, and I've lost the accent, but I bear the scars. Yes. And and as a Southerner, I mean, I think there is just something very truthful about Flannery O'Connor's fiction.
Yes, I would agree with you entirely, and that like all great art, it speaks the truth because it is the truth, whether it's invented or whether not invented, if it's a short story or poem or some kind of reporting, it lives because it is truthful about the artist's relationship to that place, and then also the artist's relationship to observation. I mean, all we have really as writers to go on is what we have, which is our observation and our feelings, right? Our ability to to live in a kind of porousness about our environment and about the people that we know. And I never get the sense that she's telling me an untruth.
I mean, she's of course, particularly if you know read her nonfiction essays, she's really quite conscious about the importance of being rooted in a place, right?
Yes.
And she said one thing you can say about the American South is that it's still a place. For all its flaws, it's still a place. There's lots of places that are nowhere, right? They could be anywhere, but the
That's
American
right.
South, at least when she was writing, had this quality of place that she sought to embody in her fiction. But
And
it seems to me,
whenever I go down there, I feel her prescience. Um, I was right before COVID lockdown, I was in Tennessee, and I was walking on a ramp going somewhere, and there were cars underneath, but also there was this incredibly elegantly dressed Black man coming toward me. And the split between his sartorial correctness and the sort of freeway of junk was completely O'Connor.
yeah, I mean, she really can come to inhabit your mind in such a way that you can. I mean, I've often described events as like I felt like I was in a Flannery O'Connor story.
Yeah, because we probably were.
Of course, but one of the flip sides, and again, as O'Connor was aware of being very rooted in a place, is that you can also embody that place's pathologies. And I think some of the recent current controversy over O'Connor is sort of picking up on that. And as she was well aware, she was very much a creature of her time and place. And
Yes.
so I guess one of the questions I have, since you yourself are a teacher, would be, how do we approach O'Connor in a classroom, particularly teaching young people who, have very different sensibilities about race than people for whom O'Connor originally wrote. I mean, so
Um,
how would you approach it?
well, I do approach it by saying exactly what you just said. I frame it, and I say this is as much of a genius of her time as Thoreau or Emerson or Dickinson, or as Stevens or Marion Moore. They're each products of a particular way of thinking, and she gets, to my mind, certainly, it's easier to target her because of the divisions because of race in her stories and in the South at that time. On the other hand, she's also always talking about the destruction of that old order, and she's also satirizing that old order, whether it's the grandmother in A Good Man Is Hard to Find, in the car when one of the children asked her where the plantation was, and she said, "It's gone with the wind, ha ha." Or when in The Artificial N-Word, the young boy goes to a city like Atlanta for the first time and experiences his sexuality vis-a-vis a Black woman. These are all ruptures in whiteness. These are all ruptures in the dream of an old South. And I think that she, unlike Faulkner, was interested in that future. She was interested in how that past was not her past anymore, that there was going to be a future, and she wanted to be included in that. I also wanted to mention something that I received recently by a wonderful writer named Angela O'Donnell. and it's a book called Radical Ambivalence that I really wanted to mention to your listeners as one of the fascinating explorations in that. So it's something that I would assign for sure, along with O'Connor, to talk about how do we talk about her now, you know?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I thought it was interesting your use of the language of rupture, because that certainly is something that runs throughout O'Connor's stories, and even in stories that don't explicitly deal with race, like A Temple of the Holy Ghost, which I think in some ways is about gender, right? And the 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 images of bodies that don't conform to boundaries.
Right.
And I think uh, so I think she really is. It is a kind of a poetics of rupture that's at work, and that's why you get the shocking violence in a story like A Good Man Is Hard to Find,
Mm-hmm.
right? But I do think one of the challenges of teaching a different generation of students is, even in a story where, like A Good Man Is Hard to Find, where the references to race are just sort of grace notes in the story. It does not really, unlike some of the other stories, it's not really driving the action of the story.
No.
But students can get like very hung up on this, right? So a character uses a particular racial epithet, and it might be the only kind of uh, overtly racial element in the story. Instantly in the student's mind, that person is classified as an evil, wicked person, when it's not clear that O'Connor intends that person to be portrayed as wicked because they used a racial epithet, right?
Well, I
So,
think that, go ahead, I'm sorry.
well, no, I was just going to say, so it's there's been such a shift in sensibility, I think, at least on a surface level, about uh, what kinds of things you can say, what kinds of things that nice people
Right.
do and don't say.
Right. I mean, I just had that kind of discussion in the New Yorker where I was writing about 3 films I liked very much. And the beginning of the piece is the argument, there's art will always challenge doctrine. So if you say, I can't speak for Frederick, or Frederick can't speak for me, and then I write a poem about Frederick, that's a great poem. Does that mean that the poem should be disallowed because I'm not Frederick? I think in America in particular, we become very reductive and very puritanical in our thinking in order to write it, right? In order to allow more conversations about certain things, we have a tendency to go way in one direction to make up for the past, but we can't make up for the past. All we can do is be vigilant about the present. And the present has all sorts of complications that we cannot explain away or eradicate. So you can take the name off of a building, for instance, but you can't take that name out of our heads. If I'm walking in Tennessee and I see that man and the cars, you can't say that that's wrong, that I'm having that thought. It's a thought that I wouldn't have had I not read Flannery O'Connor. So I think we need to, um, it's not even allow, but encourage conversation around these issues. We're not going to make the world the way it should be ever in this life. All we can do is contribute to the discussion of what the world is and what from our own perspective. And that's what she gave us. That's such a tremendous gift. She wasn't saying it's right. I mean, look at a long story like The Displaced Person, where she makes comments about poor whiteness and blackness, Mrs. Shortley, right?
Right.
And this is the character based on her mother. And this woman, at the end of the story, she has a stroke. I mean, it's her mother, and she sort of she silences her. Now, is that bad? Or is it a point that she's trying to make about that old kind of way of thinking and speaking? get silenced, or is it sort of weirdly weirdly funny? Are we in the, how can we judge? We cannot judge an artist's intentions. All we can judge is the product. And I think that we cannot root out what has made us Americans. All we can do is understand it.
I mean, I think one of the issues with somebody like O'Connor, and I think you're right about, we judge the product, not the intention. But of course, with the publication of The Habit of Being in the early 70s, O'Connor's letters became part of her public work. Whether that would have been her intention or not, I rather think it probably wouldn't have been. But they became part of her body of literary work, and it seems that, and I know many people who have read O'Connor's fiction and didn't like it, but then read the letters and then went back and read the fiction, and that was kind of an entry point for them. But I think the fact that her letters have become part of the body of literary work, in a sense, invites people to try and judge the fiction in terms of this, if you will, the character of Flannery O'Connor that's created in the letters, right? So I think there's a temptation to want to judge the intention rather than the product.
Well, again, I think that that's pretty reductive. I feel that there are ways for us to talk about this material that has nothing to do with wanting to tear down reputation. I myself probably there are letters in the world where I said something disparaging about someone that I would rather correct. But we have to remember that I believe she was 36 when she died.
I think 39. Yeah.
39. And if any of us are lucky to know ourselves at 35, we're fortunate. She stuck permanently in a kind of amber of a young woman. And her higher self was in the art, of course. And then there was herself. And there was also her relationship to the correspondence, her relationship to jokes, all of that stuff. I'm not excusing her because, as I told you earlier, Frederick, I was afraid to read a prayer journal for that very reason. And none of that stuff is in there. But I think it doesn't reflect well on us if we read reductively, if we challenge reductively and say, that because Bill Robinson danced with Shirley Temple for money, that his artistry is less. He was still Bill Robinson, and he was still a significant Black artist. I think if we start editing those films and cutting things out, it doesn't help us develop the skills that we need to argue intelligently and cohesively. It should really be about how do we get together as opposed to how we get apart.
Well, now, do you think that there are artists who, at least formally speaking, have created, impressive works of art, who, because of maybe the content of it, we should just put on the shelf? We should stop engaging it.
I mean, okay, so here's another example. Should we stop reading Proust because he was a self-hating Jew? The thousands of pages that we can learn from. Are we book burning? Are we going to burn Proust because he's a self-hating Jew? Are we going to burn Susan Sontag's books because she was more interested in male power than feminism? Are we going to say that James Baldwin shouldn't have written Giovanni's Room because it's a white protagonist? Are we going to say that Maria Tallchief, a Native American dancer, shouldn't have done The Queen and Sleeping Beauty because it's a white ballet? I mean, the list goes on and on and on. And what we're limiting when we say things like this is we're limiting our chance to be inspired by someone's imagination. We're limiting our human desire to tell stories that don't include us, but are reflective of who we are as a person and as a people. Are we going to say that Rousseau shouldn't have painted scenes that included Black figures, and he's never been to Burma? Or what are we saying about what we're saying here? Ultimately, affects the imagination, and I don't want to. I think it's one of the great gifts of God, that we are able to use metaphors and that we are able to tell stories about the human condition, and that we can find in ourselves this incredible well of emotional experience that is not directly us, it's human. And so I'm not really with it when it comes to, well, I should only speak for Black gay men because that's what I am. How boring for me to not be able to write about Flannery O'Connor, or to write a short story where I imagine myself as someone else, speaking in the voice of someone else. You know, there was, when Toni Morrison was first teaching at Princeton, she would say, you know, write me a story, to her students, write me a story about a Mexican flower girl, invent. I don't believe that writing what you know is valuable now because you're 20 and you don't know anything. So invent something. And she said it was like a door opening, because then they were free. And I think that I don't want the oppression of doctrine. I want the freedom of the imagination.
Um, so yeah, I guess one of the things Alice Walker has talked about with regard to Flannery O'Connor is how O'Connor, in some sense, never tried to enter into the interiority of the Black characters in her.
She never did that. She never ever assumed that.
So I think that's sort of,
that's the kind of grace, right?
yeah, but also suggests that she recognized certain limits to her imagination, right? That she knew that this was something that she could not imagine, or at least not imagine well enough to make it compelling in a story.
And she had no right to it.
Yeah.
I mean, she has that extraordinary comment that I love quoting whenever I get the chance, where she says that the Black man is a person of elaborate manners to protect himself. I don't know one white person from 1950 whatever to now who would have that kind of insight and grace about Blackness. I just wouldn't, from the South or the North.
Yeah.
So sure, I'm with, tearing down monuments for idiots that separated families and threw people overboard, but not for someone who can give me something like that. I'm not with that, no.
So what do you think? I mean, you used the term Puritanism earlier. So what do you think is driving? I mean, do you think that there is a kind of a new Puritanism? And if so, what's driving it?
As I said, I think that we have a tendency to go one way often in order to right ourselves. And I think that we are in that present moment, and that eventually I hope that we get to right ourselves. But it is a puritanical strain that has always existed in this country for things to end up either as a yes vote or a no vote, that we have never been comfortable, other than our artists, comfortable in shading, in we've never been comfortable with ambiguity. And this is what great artists like Melville give us, even in their titles, right? Pierre or the Ambiguities. Flannery O'Connor, The Displaced Person. Ralph Ellison, The Invisible Man. Toni Morrison, Song of Solomon. Walden. These are all books and people who dealt with American ambiguity. And are we to burn those books now because we need a yes vote or a no vote about correctness? I don't think we should stand with that or for it, because it's robbing us of our native intelligence and our ability to really love other people. You can't have that. You can't be doctrinaire and love other people. You have to be doctrinaire and love people like yourself. And that we don't learn from at all. We learn from our ambiguities, and we learn how to love all sorts of people because we're not certain.
You mentioned earlier O'Connor's, and I agree with you, extraordinary remark about the Black man as a man of elaborate manners to protect himself. And of course, in O'Connor's work, the term manners is almost a technical term of art for her, and her collection of essay Mystery and Manners, and it seems to me that one way to think about the ambiguity that's particular to O'Connor's work is this combination of mystery and manners, that you need a structure, the manners, but it's precisely in to use your earlier term, the rupturing of this structure that mystery reveals itself.
That's right.
But I think, having taught a lot of O'Connor over the years in theology classes, I find students are often made profoundly, even aside from the racial issues, just in terms of what happens in the story, students are made profoundly uncomfortable. And I think it's precisely because it's the rupturing of manners by mystery.
Yeah. The things that we can't explain. I mean, always in her stories, at some point, and I think she always said it was moments of grace, where I think Greenleaf, where the bull happens and then runs over the person. I can't remember the ending, but you can't, I think when she says grace, you can't explain nature. You can't explain the phenomenon of atmosphere, elements, and us as these weak, hairless, bipedal creatures roaming around in a force that is greater than us, whether that force is God, or you want to call it nature, or you want to call it atmosphere. It cannot be explained. And so when we atomize race, or when we say, well, they made a mistake about women or whatever, we're not making room at all for the fact that those issues are minuscule compared to the phenomenon of grace and belief in another human being. I think she was always, in her isolation and in her work, trying to connect, and trying to connect through the chasm of a racial past.
Mm. Well, unfortunately, it looks like our time is up. I really want to thank you. I thoroughly have enjoyed this conversation. I hope the participants in the webinar have enjoyed it as much as I have.
Oh, Frederick, it was so nice to meet you. Thank you for having me.
And this is, just to remind people, this is the first of 3 of these webinars on the work of O'Connor. I believe Alice McDermott, it will be our second conversation partner. But Professor Als, thank you very, very much.
Oh, Frederick, it was great to meet you. And when you come down to New York, let me know.
I will definitely do that.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye. Well, thank you to all our participants, and I look forward to hearing our next event, the conversation of Kay Whitehead with Alice McDermott. So thank you.